The prison woke before the sun. It always did on execution days. A cold silence hung in the corridors of Riverbend maximum security, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and made even the hardest guards move with something close to reverence. Or maybe it was dread. Hard to tell the difference after enough years in a place like this. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song, flickering occasionally like dying stars in a concrete universe. They cast harsh shadows across the faces of men who had seen too much, who had locked away too many, who had watched too many final walks down these same halls. But today felt different. Even the veterans sensed it. In cell block D, the death row wing, a single man sat on the edge of his bunk. His hands were clasped between his knees, elbows resting on his thighs, head bowed as if in prayer. But Marcus Brennan wasn't praying. He was remembering. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. 3 years of prison food had carved away the muscle he'd once carried with pride, the strength that had made him one of the most respected K-9 handlers in the Memphis Police Department. His hair, once dark brown and kept military short, had gone silver at the temples. Deep lines etched his face, the kind that come not from age but from carrying weight no man should have to bear. He was 52 years old. In 8 hours, he would be dead. The state of Tennessee had decided that Marcus Brennan, decorated officer, 12-year veteran of the K-9 unit, recipient of the Medal of Valor, was a cold-blooded murderer. They said he had shot Detective Roland Pierce, his friend of 15 years, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Memphis. They said the evidence was clear. They said his own partner, a German shepherd named Shadow, had turned on him that night, barking accusations that even a loyal dog couldn't suppress. They said a lot of things. None of them were true, but truth didn't matter when the jury had already made up their minds. Truth didn't matter when the physical evidence pointed in only one direction. Truth didn't matter when the system needed someone to blame someone, to punish someone, to parade before the cameras as proof that justice still meant something in a world gone mad. Marcus lifted his head slowly as footsteps echoed down the corridor. 3 sets. Heavy boots on concrete, the rhythm steady and inevitable as a heartbeat counting down. The steel door at the end of the block buzzed and clicked open. Warden Samuel Blackwell entered first, a tall man with iron gray hair and a face carved from granite. Behind him came 2 others, a chaplain in black carrying a worn leather Bible, and a guard young, nervous, trying hard not to show it. They stopped outside Marcus's cell. The warden's keys jingled softly as he selected the right one. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet. Brennan. The warden's voice was firm but not unkind. He'd been doing this job for 23 years. He knew the difference between the guilty and the damned. It's time for the final protocol. Marcus stood slowly. His joints ached. Everything ached these days. You know how this works, Blackwell continued. In approximately 8 hours, you'll be transferred to the execution chamber. Before that happens, you're entitled to one final request, within legal parameters, of course. The chaplain stepped forward, Father O'Brien, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and hands that had held too many dying men. Is there anyone you'd like to see, son, family, a friend, someone to pray with? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely talked anymore. What was the point? I want to see Shadow. The 3 men exchanged glances. The young guard's eyebrows lifted. Father O'Brien's face showed confusion. But Warden Blackwell, he just nodded slowly as if he'd been expecting something like this. Your K-9 partner, the warden said. Not a question, a confirmation. Yes. He's been retired for 3 years, Brennan. Living with another handler now. Officer Cross, I believe. I know. Another pause. The chaplain shifted uncomfortably. Son, wouldn't you rather see your sister? Or perhaps no. Marcus's voice was quiet but absolute. Just Shadow, that's all I want. The warden studied him through the bars. Whatever he saw in Marcus's face must have satisfied him, because he nodded once, sharp and final. I'll make the arrangements. It's unusual, but I'll make it happen. Thank you. As they turned to leave, the young guard couldn't help himself. Sir, I don't understand. Why a dog? Why not your family? Marcus looked at him, really looked at him. The kid was maybe 25, fresh-faced, probably thought he understood how the world worked. He didn't. Not yet. Because Shadow is the only one who knows I'm innocent, Marcus said softly. He was there. He saw everything. And he's the only family I've got left. The words hung in the air long after the three men had left, long after the steel door had buzzed shut again, long after Marcus had sat back down on his bunk and returned to his memories. Because that's all he had now. Memories of a life before. Memories of a partner who had been more than just a working dog. Memories of the night everything fell apart. And memories of a bond that not even 3 years of separation could break. 11 years ago, Marcus Brennan had been a different man. Younger, stronger still, carrying hope in his chest like a shield against the darkness of the job. He'd been a patrol officer for 4 years, then made detective, but something had always felt incomplete. He was good at his job, respected by his peers, but there was an emptiness he couldn't name. Then Lieutenant Garrett Vaughn had called him into his office one February morning. Vaughn had been Marcus's mentor since day one, a legend in the department. 26 years on the force, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of cop who commanded respect just by walking into a room. He'd taken Marcus under his wing early, taught him everything about being a real officer. Honor, duty, the thin blue line, all of it. Brennan, Vaughn had said, gesturing to a chair, "How'd you like to try something different?" Marcus had sat. "Different house, sir. K9 unit, we've got a new batch of prospects coming in from a breeder up in Ohio. Most of them will go to experienced handlers, but there's one." Vaughn had paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's one that needs someone patient, someone who understands that trust isn't given, it's earned." And that's how Marcus had met Shadow. The puppy had been 8 weeks old, all oversized paws and uncertain eyes. The breeder had pulled him from the litter last, and Marcus had understood why immediately. While the other puppies bounded forward eagerly, tails wagging, this one hung back, watchful, wary. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, but also fear. "This one had a rough start," the breeder had explained. "Previous owner wasn't kind. We got him out, but he's skittish. Might not make the cut for police work." Marcus had knelt down slowly, extending his hand palm up. Non-threatening, patient. The puppy had watched him for a long moment, then taken one tentative step forward, then another. Then his cold nose had touched Marcus's palm, and something had clicked into place. "I'll take him," Marcus had said. "You sure? Like I said, he might not." "I'm sure." The drive back to Memphis, the puppy had sat in a crate in the back of Marcus's truck, whining softly. Marcus had talked to him the whole way, his voice low and steady, telling him about the house they'd go to, the backyard with the big oak tree, the life they'd build together. "You and me," Marcus had said, "we're going to be partners. I don't know what happened to you before, but that's over now. Where you go, I go. Always. That's a promise." By the time they'd pulled into the driveway, the whining had stopped. The puppy had been watching Marcus through the crate door, head tilted, as if trying to understand this strange human who spoke to him like an equal. The training had been slow, patient. Marcus had never raised his voice, never forced the issue. Every morning before dawn, they'd been at the training facility. Basic commands first. Sit, stay, come. But more than that, trust exercises. Teaching the puppy, who Marcus had named Shadow, for the way he followed close in those early days that humans could be relied upon. Slowly, week by week, the fear had faded. Confidence had grown in its place. Shadow's natural intelligence had emerged sharp and focused. His instincts, once suppressed by trauma, had awakened. By 6 months old, he was outperforming dogs twice his age. By a year, he was legendary. Marcus remembered the first time Shadow had saved a life. A missing child case, a 7-year-old girl who had wandered away from a family camping trip in the Smoky Mountains. 20 officers had been searching for 16 hours. The girl's scent trail had been degraded by rain and wind. Everyone had been close to giving up. But Shadow hadn't given up. He'd picked up something the others had missed, a trace so faint another dog would have ignored it. He'd pulled Marcus 3 miles off the main search grid through dense underbrush and rocky terrain, never wavering. They'd found her in a small cave, hypothermic but alive. Shadow had laid down next to her, sharing his warmth until the paramedics arrived. The girl's mother had sobbed and thanked Marcus, but he'd shaken his head and pointed at Shadow. Thank him. He's the one who wouldn't quit. After that, they'd been unstoppable. Drug busts, fugitive captures, evidence recovery. Marcus and Shadow had become the team other officers requested specifically. They'd worked as one unit, reading each other's signals, without words, moving through dangerous situations, with a synchronicity that seemed almost supernatural. Off-duty, Shadow had slept at the foot of Marcus's bed. They'd run together every morning 5 miles through the neighborhood before the sun rose. They'd eaten breakfast together, Marcus at the table, Shadow beside him with his own bowl. When Marcus had gone through a rough patch after a difficult case involving a murdered teenager, Shadow had sensed it. For 3 nights straight, the dog had pushed his head under Marcus's hand whenever the nightmare started, grounding him, bringing him back. No judgment, just presence. You're more than a partner, Marcus had told him one night, scratching behind his ears. You're my brother, you know that, right? Shadow had looked at him with those intelligent, dark eyes and placed one paw on Marcus's knee. A gesture so deliberate, so full of understanding that Marcus had felt tears sting his eyes. Where you go, I go, he'd whispered. Always. And for 11 years that promise had held true. Through every call, every danger, every moment of doubt. They'd been inseparable. 2 halves of one whole. Until the night in the warehouse. The night everything burned down. 3 years ago, October. The air had already turned cold, carrying the promise of an early winter. Rain had been falling for 2 days straight, turning the streets slick and the abandoned industrial district on the outskirts of Memphis into a maze of shadows and rust. Marcus remembered every detail of that night. He'd replayed it 1,000 times in his cell, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to find the moment where everything had gone wrong. The call had come in just after 11 p.m., a tip about a weapons cache possibly tied to a gang that had been terrorizing the South Side for months. The location was an old warehouse, long abandoned, the kind of place where bad things happened and nobody asked questions. Lieutenant Vaughn had personally assigned Marcus to check it out. Take Shadow, he'd said. Should be straightforward, but I want eyes on it before we commit more resources. Pierce is already en route. He'll meet you there. Detective Roland Pierce, one of the best men Marcus had ever known. Salt of the earth, honest to his core, a dedicated cop who still believed the badge meant something. They had worked together for 15 years, had each other's backs more times than Marcus could count. Roland's wife Sarah made the best cornbread in Tennessee, and Marcus had spent countless Sunday dinners at their table, laughing and trading war stories. Roland had been more than a colleague. He'd been family. But 2 months before that night, something had changed. Marcus remembered it clearly now. Roland sitting in his car outside the precinct, looking exhausted. Shadows under his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than just a long shift. Marcus had knocked on the window. You okay, Roland? Roland had looked up, startled, then gestured for Marcus to get in. I need to tell you something, Mark. But not here. Not yet. What's going on? I'm documenting everything. Roland had said, his voice low and intense. Everything. Bank transfers, case files, recordings. If something happens to me, Sarah knows where to find it. Safety deposit box at First Tennessee. Just in case. Marcus had felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about? Nothing's going to happen to you. In this job, you never know. Roland had gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. I found something, Mark. Something big. Corruption that goes high up. Real high. I'm building the case, but I need to be careful. These aren't people who'll just accept exposure. Who are you investigating? Roland had looked at him, conflict clear in his eyes. Then he'd shaken his head. Not yet. When I have everything locked down, you'll be the first person I tell. I promise. But right now, the fewer people who know, the safer everyone is. Marcus had wanted to push to demand answers, but he'd respected Roland too much to force it. Just promise me you'll be careful. Always am. Roland had managed a tired smile. Besides, if anything does happen, the evidence will speak for itself. I've made sure of that. Marcus had climbed out of the car, watching Roland drive away into the Memphis twilight. He'd felt uneasy, but pushed it aside. Roland was a veteran. He knew what he was doing. Now sitting in his death row cell, Marcus understood that conversation had been a warning. Roland had known he was in danger, had known he might not survive what he was uncovering, and he'd made sure the truth would outlive him. If only Marcus had paid more attention. If only he'd pushed harder for answers. Maybe Roland would still be alive. That rainy October night, Marcus had driven through the downpour with Shadow in his custom kennel, in the back of the SUV windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the deluge. The industrial district had been dark street lights, long dead, only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the skeletal remains of factories and warehouses that had once employed thousands. The Target building had loomed ahead, a massive structure of corrugated metal and broken windows. Roland's unmarked car had been parked outside already, driver's door open, interior light on, but no sign of Roland himself. Marcus had felt it then, a cold whisper of wrongness crawling up his spine. "Easy, boy," he'd said to Shadow as he'd opened the kennel. The dog had emerged, alert, ears forward, nose already working. He'd sensed it too. They'd approached the warehouse entrance cautiously. The metal door had been ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, darkness had swallowed everything beyond the first few feet. Marcus had clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the black like a knife. "Roland," his voice had echoed off metal walls. "It's Brennan. You in here?" No answer, just the sound of rain drumming on the roof water, dripping through rusted holes in the ceiling. Shadow had moved ahead, his body low and tense. Suddenly, he'd stopped blocking Marcus's path. A low growl had rumbled in his chest, barely audible but unmistakable. The kind of warning Shadow only gave when danger was imminent. Marcus had raised his weapon senses, sharpening. "Who's there? Police! Show yourself!" Then he'd heard it. Voices, deep in the warehouse, coming from behind a wall of stacked crates. Two men arguing. One voice he'd recognized immediately, Roland Pierce. The other voice had been lower, harder, familiar, but he couldn't place it in the moment. Marcus had moved closer, Shadow at his heel, both of them silent as ghosts. The conversation had become clearer. "I can't do this anymore, Vaughn." Roland's voice strained, desperate. "I have proof, bank transfers, case files, everything in. You've been planting evidence for years." Marcus's blood had gone cold. "Vaughn, Lieutenant Vaughn." "Frank, you're making a mistake." That was Vaughn's voice, calm and measured. The voice of a man in control. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand exactly what I'm dealing with. Corruption. You've destroyed lives, sent innocent people to prison, all for what? Money, power. For survival. For keeping this city from tearing itself apart. You think the system works by following the rules. The rules are for idealists and fools. Then I'm a fool because I'm going to internal affairs in the morning. This ends now." A pause. Heavy. Deadly. "No, Frank. It ends right here." Marcus had started to move to intervene, but something had slammed into him from behind. Hard. Brutal. He'd felt a sharp, burning pain in his left shoulder, just below the collarbone. He'd gasped, stumbled forward, his flashlight flying from his hand and clattering across the concrete floor. Shadow had exploded into action, snarling and launching himself at the attacker. Marcus had heard a cry of pain, the sound of teeth meeting flesh, then a heavy boot connecting with Shadow's ribs. The dog had yelped and crashed into a stack of metal pipes. Marcus had tried to turn to see who had attacked him, but his vision had been swimming. Blood had been running hot down his chest, soaking his shirt. He'd reached for the wound and his hand had come away red and slick. Then the gunshot had cracked through the warehouse like thunder. 1, 2, 3 shots in rapid succession. Marcus had seen Roland Pierce collapse, clutching his chest, blood spreading across his jacket, seen him fall to his knees, then forward onto his face, motionless. No, Marcus had tried to shout, but it had come out as a whisper. He'd stumbled toward Roland, his own blood loss making his legs weak. Hands had grabbed him. Someone had pried his service weapon from his holster. Marcus had tried to fight, but he'd been fading fast. Shock and blood loss stealing his strength. Through the haze, he'd heard Vaughn's voice, cold and clinical. Plant his prints on the gun. Make it look like a struggle. Hutchins wiped down the knife and pocketed it. We've got maybe 2 minutes before backup arrives. Hutchins, Officer Kyle Hutchins, a junior cop Marcus had trained himself. The kid had stabbed him. Shadow had been barking frantically trying to reach Marcus, but someone had kicked him away again. The dog's barks had echoed through the warehouse, desperate and furious. Marcus had felt himself being positioned, his hand forced around something metal and warm. His gun. He tried to pull away, but he'd had no strength left. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Vaughn's face had appeared above him, emotionless. You shouldn't have been here, Marcus. I'm sorry it had to be you. But somebody has to take the fall. Then darkness, complete and absolute. The last thing Marcus had heard was Shadow barking, the sound growing fainter as consciousness slipped away. When he'd woken up, he'd been in a hospital bed handcuffed to the rails. 2 officers he didn't know had been standing guard. The TV on the wall had been playing the news. Decorated police officer Marcus Brennan has been arrested for the murder of Detective Roland Pierce. Sources say Brennan shot his colleague during what appears to be a botched robbery attempt. The motive remains unclear, but investigators report that Brennan's own K9 partner was found barking aggressively at the scene, with some witnesses suggesting the dog appeared to be accusing his handler. Marcus had closed his eyes. The nightmare had just begun. The trial had been swift and brutal. 3 months from arrest to verdict. The prosecution had built their case like a fortress, every brick mortared with physical evidence that seemed irrefutable. The murder weapon, Marcus's service pistol, ballistics confirmed. His fingerprints on the grip, the trigger, the barrel. Gunshot residue on his hands and clothes. His blood and Roland's blood intermixed at the scene, suggesting a close-quarter struggle. And most damning of all, the narrative they'd constructed. A decorated cop under stress, cracking under the weight of the job, turning on a colleague in a moment of madness. The prosecutor had been a woman named Margaret Sinclair, sharp as broken glass and twice as cutting. She'd stood before the jury in her immaculate navy suit and painted Marcus as a monster wearing a badge. Ladies and gentlemen, we often speak of the thin blue line, the bond between officers, the brotherhood that holds when everything else falls apart. But what happens when that line is crossed? What happens when one of our protectors becomes a predator? She clicked a remote. Crime scene photos had appeared on the screen. Roland Pierce face down in a pool of blood. The warehouse dark and ominous. Marcus's service weapon in an evidence bag. Marcus Brennan was trusted, respected, decorated. He had spent 12 years serving this community alongside his K9 partner, Shadow. But on the night of October 15th, something in Marcus Brennan broke. And Detective Roland Pierce, a husband, a father, a 20-year veteran of this police force, paid the ultimate price. Marcus had sat at the defense table, hands folded, watching the jury's faces as they absorbed every word. Some looked angry, some looked sad. None looked sympathetic. His lawyer, a public defender named Thomas Webb, who meant well but was overworked and outmatched, had done his best. But what defense could stand against that kind of evidence? My client was stabbed that night, Webb had argued. He told officers at the scene that someone else was present, someone who attacked him. Sinclair had demolished that argument in seconds. The defendant had minor scratches and bruising consistent with a physical altercation. The medical examiner found no evidence of a stab wound requiring medical intervention. Mr. Brennan's claims of a mysterious third party are nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for his actions. But it was the dog that had sealed Marcus's fate. Sinclair had played the footage from the body cameras of the officers who'd arrived first on scene. The warehouse, Roland's body, Marcus barely conscious, covered in blood and shadow. The German Shepherd had been barking frantically, straining against the makeshift restraint an officer had fashioned, focused intently on Marcus. To anyone watching who didn't know better, it looked exactly like what the prosecution claimed, an accusation. Even his own partner, Sinclair had said, her voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. The animal he had trained and worked with for 11 years recognized that something was terribly wrong. Dogs are loyal, ladies and gentlemen, loyal to a fault. But even loyalty has its limits when confronted with violence and murder. Marcus had wanted to scream. Shadow hadn't been barking at him. Shadow had been trying to warn him, trying to protect him. But how could he make anyone understand that? How could he explain what he'd seen in those final moments before losing consciousness? He'd testified in his own defense. It had been his only chance. Webb had led him through it gently. Mr. Brennan, in your own words, tell the jury what happened that night. Marcus had taken a breath and spoken the truth. All of it. Arriving at the warehouse, hearing Vaughn and Roland arguing, the attack from behind, the stabbing, watching Roland get shot, Vaughn's voice giving orders to Hutchins, the framing. The jury had listened with skeptical faces. When he'd finished, Sinclair had approached for cross-examination like a shark scenting blood. Mr. Brennan, you claim Lieutenant Garrett Vaughn, a decorated officer with 26 years of exemplary service, murdered Detective Pierce. Is that correct? Yes. And you claim Officer Kyle Hutchins, who has no disciplinary record and has been commended twice for bravery, stabbed you and helped frame you. Correct. Yes. And yet the only evidence we have is your word. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, nothing but the testimony of a man found holding the murder weapon covered in the victim's blood. I know how it looks, but no further questions. The character witnesses Vaughn had provided had been devastating. Fellow officers had testified about Marcus's recent mood changes, his increasing isolation, his obsessive relationship with his canine partner. They'd painted a picture of a man losing his grip on reality. Vaughn himself had taken the stand, looking every inch the distinguished veteran. He'd spoken about Marcus with what seemed like genuine sadness. I mentored that young man, taught him everything I knew. I never saw this coming. If I'd recognized the signs, maybe I could have prevented this tragedy. Marcus had watched his mentor lie under oath and felt something break inside him that would never heal. The jury had deliberated for 2 hours and 43 minutes. When they'd returned, the forewoman's face had told Marcus everything he needed to know before she'd spoken a single word. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Brennan, guilty of murder in the first degree. Roland Pierce's widow, Sarah, had sobbed in the gallery. His daughter had screamed that Marcus should rot in hell. The judge had gavelled for order. The sentencing phase had been even worse. Sarah Pierce had stood before the court, tears streaming down her face, and begged the judge to impose the death penalty. My husband was a good man. He dedicated his life to protecting the city. Marcus Brennan took him from me, from our daughter, from everyone who loved him. Life in prison isn't enough. Justice demands the ultimate punishment. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Holloway, had agreed. Marcus Brennan, you have been found guilty of the first-degree murder of Detective Roland Pierce. Taking into consideration the severity of this crime, the betrayal of your oath as a police officer, and the devastating impact on the victim's family, I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection. The gavel had fallen. Marcus's life had ended, even though he had still been breathing. They'd taken him away in chains. As they'd led him from the courtroom, he'd caught one final glimpse of Shadow. The dog had been brought to the courthouse, part of the ceremony of stripping Marcus of everything. Officer Wyatt Cross, a young handler, had been holding Shadow's leash. The dog had lunged when he'd seen Marcus whining desperately. Cross had struggled to hold him back. Marcus had stopped, even though the guards had been pulling at him. For one moment, he and Shadow had locked eyes across the courtroom. I'm sorry, boy, Marcus had whispered. I'm so sorry. Then they dragged him away. The last thing he'd heard had been Shadow's howl, a sound of pure anguish that had echoed through the halls of justice like a prophecy of doom. He'd never seen Shadow again, until today. The hours had crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus had sat in his cell listening to the prison wake-up around him. The clang of doors, the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of voices. Normal sounds of institutional life, except today wasn't normal. Today was his last day. Around noon, Warden Blackwell had returned with Father O'Brien. "Your request has been approved," Blackwell had said. "Shadow will be here in 3 hours. Officer Cross is bringing him from Knoxville. We've arranged for the meeting to take place in the execution wing waiting room. You'll have 30 minutes. Marcus had nodded, not trusting his voice. "I have to ask," the warden had continued, "what are you hoping for here?" "Brennan, close your forgiveness. The dog isn't going to understand what's happening." Marcus had looked at him steadily. He already understands. He always has. The waiting had been the hardest part. Marcus had paced his small cell 6 steps one way, 6 steps back. His shoulder had ached where Hutchins had stabbed him 3 years ago. The wound had healed, but the scar remained a ridge of tissue just below his collarbone. He'd never really looked at it, never wanted to acknowledge it. But now, with Shadow coming, he'd pulled his shirt aside and studied it in the small mirror mounted to the wall. Deep, precise, the kind of wound that should have required stitches, maybe even surgery. But in all the chaos and all the focus on Roland's death, nobody had properly documented it. It had been written off as minor trauma from the struggle. One more piece of the truth buried under lies. At 3:30, a guard had come to get him. "Time, Brennan." They'd shackled his wrists and ankles, standard protocol for death row inmates being moved. The chains had clinked softly as he'd walked, a sound he'd grown used to over 3 years. They'd led him down corridors he knew by heart, through security checkpoints, deeper into the belly of the prison. The execution wing had been separate from general population, a self-contained unit designed for one purpose. The air had felt different here, colder, more final. They'd brought him to a small room with concrete walls painted institutional beige, a few plastic chairs, a table, fluorescent lights that buzz faintly. One door in, one door out. No windows. The room where condemned men waited for their last march. Warden Blackwell had been there. Father O'Brien. 2 guards, and Officer Wyatt Cross, young, maybe 30, wearing the dark blue uniform of a K-9 handler. He looked nervous. "Officer Cross has been Shadow's handler for the past 3 years," Blackwell had explained. "He'll maintain control of the animal at all times during this visit, for everyone's safety." Marcus had nodded. "I understand." "One more thing." Cross had spoken up, his voice tight. "Shadow. He's not the same dog you knew, Mr. Brennan. He's older. The retirement hasn't been easy on him. He doesn't work anymore. Doesn't really connect with anyone. He just exists. I thought you should know." "He's waiting for something," Marcus had said quietly. "Sir, he's waiting. Dogs don't forget. They don't give up. He's been waiting for 3 years to tell someone the truth." Cross had looked like he'd wanted to argue, but Warden Blackwell had raised a hand. "Let's just get this done. Bring the dog in." Cross had left through the outer door. For a moment, silence had filled the room, heavy and expectant. Marcus's heart had been pounding so hard he'd been sure everyone could hear it. Then he'd heard it, the clicking of claws on linoleum, getting closer, and a sound he'd recognize anywhere, the particular rhythm of a German shepherd's breathing, slightly faster than normal, alert and focused. The door had opened. Shadow had entered the room, and Marcus's heart had broken all over again. 11 years since they'd first met. Shadow was 11 years old now, the same age he'd been Marcus's partner. Ancient for a working dog. His muzzle had gone completely gray-silver, spreading back across his face like frost. His eyes, once sharp and bright, had carried a weariness that seemed to reach into his soul. He'd moved stiffly, arthritis in his hips, obvious in the careful way he'd placed his paws. But he was still Shadow, still powerful despite his age, still carrying himself with the dignity of a warrior who had seen battle and survived. Cross had held the leash firmly. Shadow had stopped just inside the doorway, head up, nose working the air, scenting, analyzing, trying to make sense of this strange place and the men in it. Then his nose had found something, a scent that cut through years and distance and pain. His entire body had gone rigid. His ears had snapped forward. His eyes had locked onto Marcus with laser focus. Marcus had felt tears burn his eyes. "Hey, boy," he'd whispered. "It's me. It's Marcus." For one perfect moment, Marcus had been sure Shadow would do what he'd always done. Run to him, lean against his leg, place that heavy head under his hand, and sigh with contentment. The reunion he'd dreamed about for 3 years. But that's not what happened. Shadow's lips had pulled back. A low, rumbling growl had started deep in his chest, not the playful warning he'd sometimes given during training. This was different, deeper, more primal. The growl had grown louder. Shadow had taken a step forward, still locked onto Marcus, his body lowering into a stance Marcus recognized all too well, the stance Shadow took when he'd identified a threat. Cross had tightened his grip on the leash. "Shadow, no. Easy, boy." But Shadow hadn't listened. The growl had become a snarl. His teeth, still white and sharp despite his age, had been fully visible now. His hackles had risen, making him look even larger. Marcus had felt his chest tighten. This couldn't be happening. Not Shadow, not after everything. "I don't understand," Cross had said, genuinely confused. "He's never acted like this before. Not even with actual suspects." One of the guards had stepped back. "Maybe we should end this. The dog's aggressive." "No," Marcus had said, his voice breaking. "Please, just give us a minute." Shadow had continued growling, but he hadn't lunged, hadn't attacked. He just stood there, locked in that intense focus, making that horrible sound that seemed to fill the entire room. Father O'Brien had moved closer. "Marcus, I think—" "Wait." Warden Blackwell had raised his hand, eyes narrowed. "Look at the dog. Really look." Everyone had turned their attention to Shadow. The German shepherd's growl had continued, but his body language had been wrong for an attack. His weight had been balanced, not coiled. His ears had been forward, not back. His eyes had been focused, analytical, not wild with rage. "He's not attacking," Blackwell had said slowly. "He's investigating." And that's when Shadow had moved. Not toward Marcus's face or chest, where an aggressive dog would target, but circling, moving around him with deliberate steps, nose working, constantly, pulling Cross along with him. Shadow had moved behind Marcus, sniffed the air near his back, then his left side. Still growling, but now it had sounded different, more insistent, like he'd been trying to communicate something. Then Shadow had stopped at Marcus's left shoulder, the scarred shoulder, the one that ached every morning when Marcus woke, the one that carried the truth nobody had wanted to see. Shadow's nose had pressed close right against the fabric of the orange jumpsuit. His breathing had changed, becoming rapid and focused. Every muscle in his body had tensed. Then he'd barked. Once. Sharp. Urgent. The kind of bark he'd only given when he'd made a detection, when he'd found what he'd been looking for. Cross's eyes had widened. "That's an alert bark." Everyone had frozen. "What?" one of the guards had asked. "An alert bark," Cross had repeated, his voice rising with a confusion and something else. Realization. Shadow just gave an alert. He found something. But that doesn't make sense. He's not a working dog anymore. He hasn't alerted on anything in 3 years. Shadow had barked again. Same intensity, same urgency. His nose had remained pressed against Marcus's shoulder. Warden Blackwell had stepped forward slowly. "Brennan, hold still." The warden's hand had reached for Marcus's collar, pulling it aside gently. The orange fabric had shifted, exposing skin beneath, and there, visible to everyone in the room, had been the scar. Thick and raised, running 4 inches below the collarbone, the kind of wound that told a story all its own. My God, Father O'Brien had breathed. Cross had moved closer, staring. That's not from a scuffle. That's a stab wound. A deep one. Shadow had stopped growling. He'd sat down directly in front of Marcus, still focused on that shoulder, and released a soft whine. Not aggressive, sad. The sound of a boy who had been carrying a burden for far too long. Marcus had looked down at his partner, at the gray muzzle and the tired eyes, and understood. Shadow hadn't been accusing him. Shadow had been trying to tell them all along, trying to show them the truth that had been carved into Marcus's flesh. He knew, Marcus had whispered, all this time. He knew I was the victim. He was trying to tell them. Warden Blackwell had straightened his face unreadable. Someone get medical in here. I want this wound documented, photographed, every detail. Sir, one of the guards had protested. The execution is scheduled for... I don't care what's scheduled. If this man was stabbed the night of the murder, if there's evidence we missed, then we have a serious problem. Cross had knelt beside Shadow, running his hand over the dog's head. All this time, he'd said softly, you were trying to tell someone. Shadow had remained focused on Marcus. Their eyes had met, and in that moment, everything else had fallen away. The room, the chains, the years of separation. It had just been them, handler and partner, connected by a bond that 3 years of injustice couldn't break. Marcus had slowly lowered himself to his knees, ignoring the protests of the guards, the chains making the movement awkward. He'd been face to face with Shadow now. I know, boy, he'd whispered. I know you tried. I know you saw everything. Shadow had leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed his head against Marcus's chest. Not the friendly greeting of before, but something deeper. A recognition, a confirmation. And for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Brennan had felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. The medical examiner arrived within 20 minutes, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves, who had seen enough prison injuries to recognize the real thing when she encountered it. She brought her camera, her measuring tools, and a decades-honed skepticism that made her opinions in court worth their weight in gold. She'd photographed the scar from 6 different angles, measured its depth with calipers, traced its path with gloved fingers while Marcus stood still as stone. Shadow had remained beside him the entire time, watchful, protective, as if making sure this truth wouldn't be buried again. This wound is consistent with a deep, penetrating stab from a blade approximately 1 inch wide. Dr. Reeves had said, her voice clinical, but her eyes sharp with questions. It would have required medical intervention. Stitches at minimum, possibly surgery, depending on what structures were damaged. And it's old, 3 years, maybe a bit more. Warden Blackwell had crossed his arms. The night of the murder. The night Brennan claims he was attacked. If this wound occurred that night, someone should have documented it. Someone should have treated it. Dr. Reeves had looked at Marcus. How did this heal? Marcus had spoken quietly, remembering. Prison infirmary. 3 days after I arrived. It got infected. They gave me antibiotics, cleaned it up. I told them I'd been stabbed the night of the arrest. They said it wasn't in any reports, so it must have happened during processing. An accident with equipment or another inmate. An accident. Dr. Reeves had shaken her head. This was no accident, Mr. Brennan. This was an attempt to kill you that fell about 2 inches short. The room had fallen silent. Even the guards had looked uncomfortable, now shifting their weight, exchanging glances that spoke of growing doubt. Shadow had pressed closer to Marcus's leg. The gesture so familiar, so achingly normal that Marcus had felt his composure crack. His hand had moved almost on its own fingers, sinking into the thick fur at Shadow's neck. The dog had leaned into the touch, a soft sound escaping him that wasn't quite a whine, wasn't quite a sigh. Relief, maybe, or recognition that finally someone was seeing the truth he'd been carrying. Warden Father O'Brien had said softly, "What does this mean for the execution?" Blackwell had stood very still, his face carved from granite, thinking through implications and procedures, and the massive legal machinery that would need to be engaged. It means we have new evidence. It means the conviction may have been based on incomplete information. It means he'd pause, choosing his words carefully. It means Brennan's execution is suspended until this can be properly investigated. Marcus had closed his eyes. The wave of emotion that had crashed over him had been so intense, he thought his knees might buckle. 3 years. 3 years of knowing the truth and being unable to prove it. 3 years of waiting for death. And now, because of Shadow, because Abo had remembered what humans had chosen to forget, there was a chance. But Warden Blackwell hadn't been finished. However, this doesn't prove innocence. It proves you were injured. We still need to understand what happened in that warehouse. We need evidence. I can tell you what happened. Marcus had opened his eyes, his voice stronger now. I can tell you everything, but I need you to listen. Really listen. Not the way they listened at trial. Blackwell had gestured to the chairs. Then talk. And Cross, keep that dog close. I want him here for this. They'd all sat except for Shadow, who had remained standing pressed against Marcus's leg like an anchor holding him to the earth. And Marcus had begun to speak, starting with the phone call from Vaughn that night, the assignment to check out the warehouse, the rain that had made visibility almost zero. He'd told them about finding Roland's car, empty, the door open. About Shadow's warning growl. About creeping into the warehouse with every instinct screaming that something was wrong. I heard voices, Marcus had said, his eyes distant, seeing it all again. Deep in the building behind the stacked crates, I recognized Roland's voice immediately. He sounded stressed, angry, not scared exactly, but determined. The way he got when he'd made up his mind about something and wouldn't be moved. What was he saying? Blackwell had asked. He was talking about evidence, about corruption. He said he had proof, bank transfers and case files. He said, Marcus had paused, the words still painful even now. He said Vaughn had been planting evidence for years. The reaction in the room had been immediate. Cross had straightened in his chair. The guards had exchanged sharp looks. Even Father O'Brien had seemed startled. Lieutenant Garrett Vaughn, Blackwell's voice had been carefully neutral. You're saying Detective Pierce was accusing your commanding officer of corruption. Not just accusing, he had evidence. I heard Vaughn's voice clear as day trying to talk him down, telling him he was making a mistake, that he didn't understand what he was dealing with. Roland wouldn't back down. He said he was going to internal affairs in the morning. He said it had to end. Marcus had swallowed hard, remembering the next part, the part that still played in his nightmares. Vaughn's voice changed, got colder. He said, no, Frank, it ends right here. And I started to move to try to get between them to stop whatever was about to happen. But someone came from behind me, fast, professional. I barely saw the movement before I felt the knife go in. His hand had moved unconsciously to his shoulder, to the scar that Shadow had found. It was like being hit with a bolt of lightning, white-hot pain that made everything else disappear. I stumbled forward, dropped my flashlight. Shadow went crazy, attacking whoever had stabbed me. I heard someone cry out, heard Shadow's teeth connect. Then something hit Shadow hard enough that he yelped. I've never heard him make that sound before or since. Shadow's ears had flicked at the mention of his name, and he'd shifted slightly, pressing even closer to Marcus. Then the gunshots. 3 of them so fast they almost sounded like one continuous sound. I saw Roland fall, saw the blood. I tried to get to him, but I was losing too much blood myself, getting weak. Someone grabbed me, took my weapon from my holster. I tried to fight, but I had nothing left. What happened next? Blackwell had leaned forward. Vaughn's voice, giving orders. He told someone to plant my prints on the gun to make it look like a struggle. Told them to wipe down the knife and get rid of it. Said they had maybe 2 minutes before backup arrived. And then, Marcus had met Blackwell's eyes. Then he looked at me, and I'll never forget his expression. Cold, calculated, like he was solving a problem, not destroying a man's life. He said, you shouldn't have been here, Marcus. I'm sorry it had to be you. But somebody has to take the fall. The room had been absolutely silent. Even the fluorescent lights had seemed to stop their buzzing. I blacked out after that, blood loss and shock. When I woke up in the hospital, I was already under arrest, and nobody would listen when I tried to tell them what really happened. Because there was no evidence, Dr. Reeves had said quietly. No knife wound documented, no third party, just you and Detective Pierce and physical evidence that seemed ironclad. And Shadow, Marcus had added, they said Shadow was barking at me, accusing me, but that's not what he was doing. Cross had spoken up, his hand resting on Shadow's head. What was he doing? Marcus had looked at his partner, and Shadow had looked back, and the understanding between them had needed no words. He was trying to warn them, trying to tell them someone else was there. But all they saw was a dog barking near his handler. They interpreted it the way they wanted to interpret it. Father O'Brien had removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly, a gesture Marcus recognized as the chaplain's way of processing difficult information. If what you're saying's true, Marcus, then Lieutenant Vaughn murdered Detective Pierce and framed you, and someone else you mentioned the name Hutchins actually stabbed you. Officer Kyle Hutchins, I trained him myself. He was young, eager, hungry to move up. Vaughn must have had hooks in him already. These are serious accusations, Blackwell had said. Against respected officers, we'll need more than your testimony to pursue this. And that's when Shadow had moved. He lifted his head, suddenly body going rigid, focused on the door to the outer corridor. A low growl had started in his chest, different from before. Not the investigative sound from earlier. This was a warning. Cross had felt it through the leash. What is it, boy? What do you smell? The door had opened. A guard had entered, one Marcus vaguely recognized but couldn't name. The man had been middle-aged, thick around the middle, with a face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Warden, shift change in 10 minutes. Need your sign-off on the execution chamber prep, even if it's postponed. Protocol requires. Shadow had exploded. The growl had become a snarl, lips pulled back fully, every tooth visible. He'd lunged toward the guard with such force that Cross had nearly lost the leash, his boots skidding on the smooth floor as he tried to hold the dog back. Shadow no down, Cross had shouted, but Shadow hadn't listened. He'd been locked onto the guard with an intensity that made his earlier behavior with Marcus look mild by comparison. The guard had stumbled backward, hands up. Jesus Christ, control that animal. But Shadow had kept coming, kept pulling, kept snarling. Not trying to actually bite, Marcus had noticed. Trying to get closer. Trying to identify. Trying to confirm what his nose was telling him. Cross, get him back. Blackwell had stood, hand moving toward his radio. But Marcus had seen something in Shadow's eyes. The same look he'd had when tracking a suspect, when closing in on a target, when he'd found exactly what he'd been searching for. Wait, Marcus had said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Let him work. Are you insane? He's out of control. No, he's doing his job. The same job he was doing 3 years ago. Marcus had stood slowly, chains clinking. Shadow, easy boy, easy, show me. The magic words. The command they'd used 1,000 times during their partnership. Show me what you found. Show me the truth. Shadow's snarl had diminished slightly, though his focus hadn't wavered. He'd continued pulling toward the guard nose, working frantically, taking in scent information and processing it against memories buried deep in his canine brain. The guard had backed against the wall. I don't know what's wrong with him. I just came to get the warden's signature. What's your name? Marcus had asked quietly. Davis, Officer James Davis. I work Block C. I'm just filling in for... You're lying. Marcus had taken a step forward despite the chains. Your name is Kyle Hutchins. You changed it. Transferred to a different facility. But Shadow knows. Dogs don't forget scents. The man's face had gone pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Shadow had barked sharp and aggressive, still straining toward him. Cross had been using both hands on the leash now, feet planted. Warden, this is the same reaction he had when he alerted on Brennan's wound. But stronger, more intense. Marcus had felt his heart pounding. 3 years, 3 years of not knowing where Hutchins had gone, of having no way to prove his claims. And now here he was, by pure chance, working in the same facility where Marcus was scheduled to die. "Shadow recognizes you," Marcus had said, his voice hard. "You were in that warehouse. You're the one who stabbed me." "That's insane. I've never seen this inmate before in my life." But his voice had been shaking. His hands had been trembling. And Shadow had known. Shadow had been absolutely certain. Warden Blackwell had stepped between them, hand raised. "Everyone calm down. Davis or Hutchins or whoever you are, I need to see your identification. Now." The man had hesitated, hand moving toward his pocket. Then his eyes had darted toward the door, calculating distances, weighing odds. "Don't," Blackwell had said quietly. "You won't make it." For a long moment the man had stood frozen. Then his shoulders had slumped. His hand had come away from his pocket empty. And when he'd spoken, his voice had been different, younger. The accent he'd been using had dropped away. Okay, my name is Kyle Hutchins. I changed it legally 2 years ago. Transferred here 6 months ago. But I didn't know Brennan was here. I swear I didn't know. They just needed someone to fill a shift, and "You stabbed me," Marcus had interrupted. "In the warehouse. On Vaughn's orders." Hutchins had looked at him, then really looked at him, and something had broken in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or exhaustion from carrying a secret too heavy for one man to bear. "Yeah," he'd whispered. "Yeah, I did." The confession had hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Reeves had her phone out recording. One of the other guards had moved to block the door. Father O'Brien had made the sign of the cross, and Shadow had finally stopped snarling. He'd sat down, mission accomplished, looking up at Marcus as if to say, "See, I told you. I've been trying to tell you all along." Warden Blackwell had pulled out his radio. "Security, I need 2 officers to the execution wing waiting room. Now, we have a situation." But Marcus had barely heard him. He'd been staring at Kyle Hutchins, at the man who had destroyed his life with a single thrust of a knife, and feeling a strange mix of vindication and rage and something deeper. Sadness, maybe. For the young officer he'd trained, who had chosen corruption over honor. "Why?" Marcus had asked softly. "I taught you everything. I trusted you." Hutchins had laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "You trusted everyone. That was your weakness." Vaughn saw it. He said you were too soft, too idealistic. Said men like you don't survive in the real world. "So you stabbed me and helped frame me for murder." "I didn't want to." Hutchins had looked away. "But Vaughn said we had no choice. Pierce was going to destroy everything. Years of work of building the network, and you showed up at exactly the wrong time." Vaughn made it sound so simple, a quick solution to multiple problems. Roland Pierce was a good man. I know he was," but Vaughn said. Hutchins had stopped shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what Vaughn said. I made the choice. I stabbed you. I planted the evidence. I watched them take you away, and I didn't say a damn word." Cross had spoken up, his voice tight with anger. "You let an innocent man sit on death row for 3 years. You were going to let him die. I tried not to think about it. Tried to pretend it never happened. That's why I changed my name, transferred facilities. I thought I could outrun it." Hutchins had looked at Shadow. "I didn't count on the dog." "Shadow never forgets," Marcus had said. "I tried to tell them that at trial. Nobody listened." The security officers had arrived, taken Hutchins by the arms. He hadn't resisted. As they'd led him toward the door, he'd stopped, turned back to Marcus. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything. I know it doesn't give you back what you lost. But I am sorry." Marcus had said nothing. There was nothing to say. Sorry didn't bring back 3 years. Sorry didn't bring back Roland Pierce. Sorry was just a word people said when they'd run out of excuses. After Hutchins had been taken away, the room had erupted into controlled chaos. Warden Blackwell had been on his phone, voice low and urgent, speaking with people Marcus couldn't see. Dr. Reeves had been making notes, documenting everything. Father O'Brien had approached Marcus, placed a hand on his shoulder. Your dog is remarkable, the chaplain had said quietly. I've never seen anything like it. Marcus had looked down at Shadow, who had settled at his feet, head on his paws, finally relaxed. He's not just a dog, he's a witness, the only honest witness to what happened in that night. Do you think they'll believe you now, with Hutchins's confession? I don't know. Hutchins admitted to stabbing me and planting evidence, but he's not the one who killed Roland. That was Vaughn, and Vaughn is... Marcus had trailed off thinking about his former mentor, the man who had shaped his career, the man who had destroyed his life. As if summoned by the thought, Warden Blackwell had ended his call and turned to Marcus. I've contacted the Attorney General's office. They're sending investigators, and I've put in a call to Lieutenant Vaughn. He needs to answer questions about these allegations. Marcus had felt ice slide down his spine. You called him here to the prison. He's still your former commanding officer. He has a right to address these accusations before any formal charges are filed. It's procedure. It's a mistake. Marcus had gripped the edge of the table. Warden, you don't understand. Vaughn is dangerous. He's not going to just confess. He's not going to break down like Hutchins did. But Shadow had interrupted, his body going rigid again. The growl that started in his chest was different from anything Marcus had heard before. Deeper, more primal. The kind of sound that spoke to millions of years of wolf DNA of pack animals defending their own against a predator. What's wrong with him now? One of the guards had asked nervously. Marcus had known before he'd consciously processed it. Shadow's reaction to Hutchins had been intense. But this was beyond intense. This was pure focused rage, barely contained by training and loyalty. The outer door had opened, and Lieutenant Garrett Vaughn had walked in. He looked exactly as Marcus remembered, 56 years old, but still commanding, still carrying himself with the authority of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades giving orders and having them followed without question. Silver hair trimmed precisely, uniform immaculate, 3 rows of ribbons on his chest, each one representing some act of service or bravery that the city had recognized and honored. He'd looked like what he'd always been, a decorated police veteran, a respected leader, a pillar of the department, and Shadow had looked at him and seen a killer. The German Shepherd had erupted from his resting position like a missile. The snarl that tore from his throat was feral savage, the sound of a predator that had found its prey after a long hunt. He'd hit the end of the leash with such force that Cross had been yanked forward, nearly losing his grip entirely. Shadow down, down, Cross had shouted, but it had been useless. Shadow had been beyond commands, beyond training, operating on instinct and memory in 3 years of suppressed knowledge. Vaughn had stopped just inside the door, hand moving instinctively toward his hip, toward the service weapon he wore. His eyes had gone wide, not with fear, but with recognition. He'd understood immediately what Shadow's reaction meant. Control that door, Vaughn had said, his voice sharp with command, but there had been something underneath. A crack in the facade, worry maybe, or calculation. Warden Blackwell had stepped between Shadow and Vaughn. Lieutenant, I need you to remain calm. The dog appears to be reacting to... I know what the dog is reacting to, Marcus had said, standing slowly despite the chains. He's reacting to the man who murdered Roland Pierce. Vaughn's eyes had shifted to Marcus. For a moment, just a moment, the mask had slipped. Marcus had seen the cold intelligence underneath the ruthless pragmatism that had let Vaughn put a bullet in a good man's chest and sleep soundly afterward. Then the mask had been back in place. Vaughn had straightened, looking every inch the offended officer. That's a serious accusation, Brennan. I came here as a courtesy to answer questions about allegations made by a convicted murderer and a dirty cop who just confessed to evidence tampering. But I won't stand here and be accused by a dog. Shadow had lunged again, pulled so hard that Cross had lost his footing, skidding forward. Other guards had jumped in, 3 of them now holding the leash, trying to restrain 85 pounds of furious German Shepherd who wanted nothing more than to reach the man by the door. He's never done this before, Cross had gasped, boots scraping for purchase. Not even with violent suspects. He's identified Vaughn as a threat. Because he is a threat, Marcus had said, his voice rising. Shadow was there, Lieutenant. He saw you shoot Roland. He heard you give orders to Hutchins to stab me to plant evidence. He's been trying to tell people for 3 years, but nobody would listen to a dog. Vaughn had laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. This is absurd. You're basing a murder accusation on a dog barking. The same dog who, according to trial testimony, was barking at you the night of the murder. He wasn't barking at me. He was trying to protect me, trying to warn me about you. That's your interpretation. Convenient now that you're facing execution. Vaughn had turned to Blackwell. Warden, I don't appreciate being called here under false pretenses. If Hutchins confessed to tampering with evidence, that's a matter for internal affairs. But it doesn't change the facts of Brennan's case. He was found at the scene covered in the victim's blood holding the murder weapon. Because you put it in my hand, Marcus had said, after you shot Roland, after Hutchins stabbed me. Prove it. The challenge had hung in the air, and that's when Shadow had done something remarkable. He'd stopped pulling, stopped snarling. He'd sat down perfectly still and looked directly at Vaughn with an intensity that made everyone in the room fall silent. Cross had blinked in surprise. What's he doing? Marcus had known. He had seen Shadow do this before, hundreds of times during their partnership. When Shadow had tracked a suspect to their hiding place, when he'd identified a car carrying drugs, when he'd found exactly what he'd been searching for and wanted his handler to take notice. He's marking, Marcus had said softly. It's what he does when he's made a positive identification, when he's absolutely certain. Shadow had barked once, sharp, final. The bark that meant target acquired, threat identified, handler take action. Father O'Brien had made the sign of the cross again. Dr. Reeves had stepped back medical training, telling her to get clear of whatever was about to happen. The guards had tensed hands moving toward their equipment. And Vaughn had finally shown his hand. His face had gone hard, the genial mask dissolving completely. His hand had moved to his hip, fingers wrapping around the grip of his service weapon. Don't, Warden Blackwell had said quietly. Whatever you're thinking, don't do it. But Vaughn hadn't stopped. He'd drawn the weapon, not pointing it at anyone yet, just bringing it clear of the holster. Control. That's what he'd always been about, maintaining control of every situation. You should have stayed quiet, Marcus, Vaughn had said, his voice cold as winter stone. You should have taken your execution like a man. But you had to keep pushing. You and that damn dog. Shadow had recognized the threat, had seen Vaughn's hand move to the weapon, and Shadow, old and gray and past his prime, had done what he'd been trained to do. What he'd done for 11 years whenever his partner was in danger. He'd attacked. The explosion of movement had been so fast that later Marcus wouldn't be able to say exactly what had happened. Shadow had yanked free from Cross and the other guards, the leash slipping through their collective grip like water. He'd covered the distance to Vaughn in 2 bounds. Vaughn had tried to bring the weapon up, tried to aim, but Shadow had been faster. 85 pounds of trained K9 had hit him at full force, jaws clamping onto Vaughn's wrist. The gun had clattered to the floor, spinning away across the concrete. Vaughn had screamed, trying to shake Shadow off, but the dog's grip had been absolute. Years of training, years of experience, years of waiting for this moment had all culminated in this one perfect execution of duty. Guards had swarmed them, pulling Vaughn down, wrestling his arms behind his back. Shadow had released once Vaughn was on the ground, stepping back, but remaining alert, ready to engage again if needed. It had been over in seconds. Vaughn face down on the concrete, hands being cuffed behind his back. Shadow standing over Marcus, breathing hard, but otherwise calm. The service weapon secured by one of the guards. Warden Blackwell had stood over Vaughn, his face a mask of controlled fury. Lieutenant Garrett Vaughn, you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon. And given what I've heard today, I suspect that's only the beginning. Vaughn had turned his head, looking up at Marcus with eyes full of venom. You think this changes anything? You think they'll believe you. Now, I've got 30 years of service, 30 years of respect. You're a convicted murderer whose only witness is a dog. That dog, Marco had said quietly, has more integrity than you ever had. They'd hauled Vaughn to his feet, started to lead him away. But at the door, he'd stopped forcing the guards to stop with him. He'd look back at Marcus one last time. I taught you everything, Marcus. Everything you know about being a cop, about honor and duty, and the thin blue line. And you want to know the real joke. It was all a lie, every word of it. There is no honor. There's only survival. And I survived by being smarter than idealists like you and Pierce. You didn't survive, Marcus had said. You just delayed the consequences. Shadow made sure of that, made sure. As they'd taken Vaughn away, his voice had echoed down the corridor. It won't stick. None of it will stick. I'll walk away from this and you'll still die. You hear me, Brennan? You'll still die. Then the door had closed and he was gone. The room had fallen into heavy silence. Everyone had been breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping from the confrontation. Shadow had returned to Marcus's side, settling against his leg, mission accomplished. Cross had picked up the leash with shaking hands. I've been handling K9S for 6 years. I've never seen anything like that. The way he identified both suspects. The way he protected you. It's like he's been waiting 3 years for this exact moment. He has been, Marcus had said, running his hand over Shadow's head. He knew the truth. He's always known. We just finally listened. Warden Blackwell had been on his phone again, speaking rapidly, issuing orders. When he'd finished, he'd looked at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. Respect, maybe, or reassessment. The Attorney General is sending a team immediately. Both Hutchins and Vaughn will be held pending investigation. And your execution, he'd paused. Your execution is officially suspended indefinitely pending a full review of your case. Marcus had nodded, not quite able to process what that meant. 3 years of waiting for death and now suddenly the possibility of life. It was too big to comprehend all at once. Father O'Brien had approached, placing both hands on Marcus's shoulders. God works in mysterious ways, my son. Who would have thought that salvation would come with 4 paws and a tail? Marcus had looked down at Shadow, who had looked back up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Eyes that had seen the truth and carried it for 3 years. Eyes that had never given up, never stopped trying to communicate what they'd witnessed. Not mysterious, Marcus had said softly. Just loyal. The most loyal partner I've ever had. Shadow's tail had thumped once against the concrete floor. And for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Brennan had allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally going to set him free. The Tennessee Attorney General's office moved with the kind of speed usually reserved for political scandals and media firestorms. Within 48 hours of Vaughn's arrest, a team of 6 investigators had descended on Riverbend maximum security like a surgical strike force. They'd brought forensic specialists, legal analysts, and a determination to understand how the system had failed so catastrophically. Marcus had been moved from death row to a secure holding cell in a different wing. Not free, not yet, but no longer waiting to die. The difference was subtle but profound. The air felt different when you weren't counting down your final hours. Shadow had been allowed to stay. An unprecedented decision, but Warden Blackwell had made it over the protests of 6 regulations. That dog is a material witness, he'd said, his tone brooking no argument. And he stays with Brennan until this is resolved. So Shadow had taken up residence in Marcus's cell, sleeping at the foot of the narrow bunk, just like he'd done for 11 years in Marcus's small house outside Memphis. The guards had brought dog food, water bowls, even a blanket. They'd stopped looking at Marcus with the cold distance reserved for condemned men and started seeing something else. A man who might actually be innocent. A man whose dog had refused to let the truth die. The investigators had started with the physical evidence. Dr. Reeves had provided her analysis of Marcus's stab wound, complete with measurements, photographs, and a scathing professional opinion about how such an injury could have been missed during the original investigation. Willful blindness or gross incompetence? she'd written in her report. Possibly both. The warehouse had been re-examined. 3 years of weather and time had erased most trace evidence, but the investigators had found something that had been overlooked in the original sweep. A combat knife, military issue buried in debris near where Marcus had been attacked. The serial number had been filed off, but modern forensics didn't need serial numbers. DNA could survive for years in the right conditions. They'd found blood in the knife's handle seam, Marcus's blood, and something else. Skin cells from whoever had gripped that handle hard enough to leave biological traces. The DNA had gone to the lab with a priority code that meant results in days, not months. Kyle Hutchins, sitting in an interrogation room with his newly assigned public defender, had broken completely. The weight of 3 years of guilt had crushed whatever loyalty he had once felt to Vaughn. He'd given them everything: dates times names. The corruption network had been bigger than anyone had suspected. 8 officers total spanning 3 precincts. 2 assistant district attorneys who'd buried evidence or steered cases. A judge who'd made inconvenient warrants disappear. And at the center of it all, Garrett Vaughn, the architect, the man who'd built an empire of corruption over 12 years, all while maintaining the facade of a decorated hero. He recruited me when I was fresh out of the academy, Hutchins had told the investigators, his voice flat with exhaustion. Said the system was broken, that good cops had to bend the rules to get real results. It started small, planting evidence on suspects we knew were guilty, but couldn't prove it. Then it got bigger. Protection money from dealers, making arrests disappear for the right price. Pierce found bank accounts, wire transfers, everything. He was going to expose all of us. So Vaughn killed him. Vaughn said Pierce was a threat to everything we'd built. Said we had no choice. I believed him. I was young and stupid, and I believed him. And Brennan, Hutchins had closed his eyes. Wrong place, wrong time. Vaughn made the call in seconds. Brennan was respected, decorated, no history of problems. Perfect scapegoat. Vaughn told me to stab him, not fatal, but enough to make him weak. Then Vaughn shot Pierce, put Brennan's gun in his hand, arranged the scene. We knew backup was coming. We'd called it in ourselves anonymous tip about shots fired. When the other units arrived, we were just 2 more officers responding to the scene. The investigator had leaned forward. And Shadow the dog. That dog knew. The whole time he knew. He was trying to get to Vaughn, trying to alert the other officers that something was wrong. But everyone interpreted it as the dog being upset about his handler. No one thought a canine could be trying to identify a suspect. The recording of that confession had been played in an emergency judicial hearing 3 days later. Judge Patricia Holloway, the same judge who had sentenced Marcus to death, had sat behind her bench with a face carved from stone as she'd listened to her own words being used to send an innocent man to his execution. The courtroom had been packed. Media in the back rows, cameras prohibited, but reporters scribbling furiously. Sarah Pierce in the front row, her daughter beside her, both of them pale and hollow-eyed. Legal observers from a dozen advocacy groups. And in the defendant's box, no longer in orange, but in civilian clothes provided by the state, Marcus Brennan had sat with Shadow at his feet. The prosecution had been represented by the Attorney General herself, a severe woman named Catherine Wells who had built a career on integrity and now faced the nightmare of one of her predecessor's greatest failures. Your Honor, she'd begun standing with perfect posture. The state of Tennessee wishes to address a grave miscarriage of justice. New evidence has come to light that fundamentally undermines the conviction of Marcus Brennan for the murder of Detective Roland Pierce. She'd laid it out methodically. The stab wound that should have been documented but wasn't. Hutchins' confession corroborated by the knife with Marcus's blood and Hutchins' DNA. The financial records subpoenaed from Vaughn's accounts showing deposits that couldn't be explained by a police salary, and the piece of evidence that had changed everything. 4 days ago, Mrs. Sarah Pierce contacted our office. She'd been going through her late husband's personal effects, something she'd been unable to do for 3 years. She found a safety deposit box key hidden in a book her husband had given her before his death. Inside that box were 2 flash drives and a handwritten journal. Wells had held up plastic evidence bags. Inside, Marcus could see the drives, small and unremarkable. The kind of thing you could buy at any electronics store. The kind of thing that could hold a man's entire investigation. Marcus had felt his breath catch. Roland's evidence. The documentation he had mentioned that day in the car. It had been there all along, waiting to be found. Detective Pierce had documented everything. Wells had continued. Bank transfers, recorded conversations, photographs of evidence being planted, case files showing discrepancies between what was reported and what actually occurred. He'd been building this case for 8 months before his death. He knew he was in danger. The last entry in his journal, dated the day he died, reads, "Meeting with Vaughn tonight. Going to give him one chance to turn himself in. If he refuses, I go to the FBI in the morning." The courtroom had been absolutely silent. Sarah Pierce had been crying quietly, her daughter's arm around her shoulders. The evidence on these drives corroborates everything Mr. Brennan has claimed. It shows a conspiracy involving Lieutenant Garrett Vaughn and 7 other officers to engage in evidence tampering, bribery, and obstruction of justice. It shows that Detective Pierce was murdered to prevent this evidence from coming to light. And it shows conclusively that Marcus Brennan was framed for a crime he did not commit. Judge Holloway had removed her glasses, cleaning them with hands that shook slightly. When she'd spoken, her voice had been rough with emotion barely contained. "I have reviewed the evidence submitted by the Attorney General's office. I have read Detective Pierce's journal. I have listened to the recordings he made, and I am forced to confront a terrible truth. This court, operating on incomplete and deliberately falsified evidence, sent an innocent man to death row." She looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Brennan, no words can adequately express the injustice that has been done to you. The system failed you in the most fundamental way possible. But today, we have an opportunity to correct that failure, however inadequately." She'd straightened in her chair, becoming once again the embodiment of judicial authority. "Having reviewed all evidence, both old and new, I find that the conviction of Marcus Brennan for the murder of Roland Pierce was obtained through fraudulent means and is not supported by legitimate evidence. Therefore, I hereby vacate that conviction. All charges against Marcus Brennan are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Brennan, you are free to go." The gavel had fallen. Marcus had sat frozen, unable to process the words. Free. After 3 years of cages and chains and counting down to death, he was free. Shadow had known before Marcus did. The dog had stood, tail wagging, looking up at his handler, with something that looked remarkably like joy. And that simple gesture, that uncomplicated happiness, had broken through Marcus's shock. He'd had dropped to his knees right there in the courtroom, arms around Shadowface, buried in the dog's fur. He'd wept. Great shuddering sobs that came from a place so deep he had thought it had died. Shadow had pressed against him, solid and warm and real, anchoring him to this moment, to this impossible reality. Sarah Pierce had approached slowly. Marcus had looked up, still on his knees, expecting anger or accusation or pain. But Sarah's face had held only sorrow and something that might have been understanding. "I am sorry," she'd said softly. "For 3 years I believed you killed my husband. I testified for your execution. I said terrible things about you. And all this time you were innocent. You were a victim, just like Frank was." Marcus had stood slowly, Shadow still pressed against his leg. "Your husband was a hero, Sarah. He died trying to do the right thing. That's not something to apologize for." But you believed what the evidence told you to believe. That's not your fault. It's Vaughn's. All of it is Vaughn's." Sarah had nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then she'd done something Marcus hadn't expected. She'd hugged him. Brief but genuine, a gesture of shared grief and shared vindication. "Frank would be glad," she'd whispered, "that you were cleared, that the truth came out. He respected you. He'd want you to know that. And he'd be glad that his evidence helped save you. That's what he would have wanted." Then she'd stepped back, composing herself, and left the courtroom with her daughter. 2 women who'd lost everything to Vaughn's corruption, but who'd help bring him down with evidence a good man had died protecting. The media had been waiting outside the courthouse, a forest of cameras and microphones and shouted questions. Marcus had stood on the steps, blinking in sunlight he hadn't seen as a free man in 3 years, with Shadow sitting calmly at his side. The questions had come rapid fire. Mr. Brennan, how does it feel to be free? What will you do now? Do you plan to sue the state? Will you return to police work? Marcus had raised a hand and the crowd had quieted. Not out of any legal obligation, but out of something else. Respect, maybe. Or curiosity about what a man wrongly condemned to death might have to say. My name is Marcus Brennan. He'd begun, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions inside him. 3 years ago, I was arrested for the murder of Detective Roland Pierce, my friend and colleague of 15 years. I was convicted on evidence that seemed overwhelming. I was sentenced to death, and I was innocent. He paused, letting that sink in. The truth was there all along, in the wound on my shoulder that nobody documented, in the testimony I gave that nobody believed, and in the memory of this dog. He'd placed his hand on Shadow's head. The cameras had clicked in word, capturing the moment. Shadow was there the night Detective Pierce was murdered. He saw everything. He tried to tell people what happened, but nobody listened, because he's a dog and we don't think dogs can be witnesses. But Shadow remembered. For 3 years, he carried the truth. And when he finally got the chance to show people what he knew, he identified both of the men who framed me. He saved my life. Twice. Once in that warehouse when he tried to protect me, and again in a prison waiting room when he refused to let the lies stand. A reporter had called out, "What happens to Lieutenant Vaughn now?" That's for the courts to decide. But I can tell you what I hope happens. I hope everyone he hurt gets justice. I hope every case he touched gets reviewed. I hope every person he sent to prison on false evidence gets their day in court. Because I'm not the only victim here. I'm just the one who had Shadow to speak for him. Will you sue? Marcus had considered the question. Money. Compensation. The state would probably offer millions to settle before he could file. But money wouldn't give him back 3 years. Money wouldn't erase the nightmares or heal the scars. I want reform, he'd said finally. I want K-9 testimony to be taken seriously as evidence. I want better documentation of injuries during arrests. I want a system that listens when someone says they're innocent, even when the evidence looks bad. That's worth more than any settlement. What will you do now? He'd look down at Shadow, who'd look back up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. I'm going home, wherever that turns out to be, as long as he's with me. The questions had continued, but Marcus had walked down the courthouse steps through the crowd to where a car waited. Not a prison transport, just a regular car driven by Officer Cross, who'd volunteered to help Marcus transition back to freedom. The drive out of Memphis had been surreal. Marcus had pressed his face to the window like a child watching the world go by. 3 years in a cell made you forget how big the sky was, how many shades of green existed in trees, how ordinary people just lived their lives without walls and bars and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Shadow had sat in the backseat calm and content, occasionally placing his paw on Marcus's knee as if to confirm this was real. They were really leaving really free. Cross had driven them to a small motel outside the city. Attorney General's office set up an account for you, he'd said, handing Marcus a debit card. For expenses while you figure things out. And this. He'd handed over a phone already activated. Your old number. They kept it active just in case. Just in case you weren't executed, Marcus had thought but didn't say. Just in case the system didn't kill an innocent man. Thank you, Marcus had said simply. Cross had hesitated, hand on the steering wheel. Shadow, he's officially retired, but his retirement assignment is to you, for life. The department wanted you to know that. Marcus had felt his throat tighten. Tell them thank you. You should tell them yourself. A lot of good cops are ashamed of what happened. A lot of people want to make this right. After Cross had left, Marcus had stood in the motel parking lot with Shadow just breathing. Free air, free sky, free future, uncertain as it was. "Come on, boy," he'd said softly. "Let's go see an old friend." The Oakwood Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Memphis, rows of white headstones marching in precise formation, like soldiers at eternal attention. Marcus had walked slowly through the grounds with Shadow at his side, reading names and dates, all these lives reduced to 2 lines carved in stone. Roland Pierce's grave was near a large oak tree, shade dappling the ground, peaceful and quiet. The headstone was simple. Detective Roland Pierce, beloved husband and father. He sought the truth and found it. Sarah must have chosen those words. After the evidence had come out, after everyone knew what Roland had died trying to expose, Marcus had stood there for a brief moment, Shadow sitting quietly beside him. Then he'd knelt, placing his hand on the cool stone. "I'm sorry, Roland," he'd whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I was right there and I couldn't stop it. Vaughn shot you and I was too weak from the stab wound to do anything. I've carried that for 3 years, the guilt of surviving when you didn't." Shadow had whined softly, pressing against Marcus's side. "But your evidence saved me. You documented everything Bill the case, kept the truth alive even after you died. You were a better cop than any of us. You didn't compromise. You didn't look away. And it cost you everything." He'd pulled something from his pocket, his old police badge returned to him that morning by the department with a formal apology and an offer to reinstate him with full rank and back pay. He placed the badge at the base of the headstone. "You died with honor, more honor than Vaughn and his whole crew ever had. I hope you're at peace. I hope you know that we got them. All of them." He does know. Marcus had turned. Sarah Pierce stood a few feet away, flowers in her hand. She must have seen them arrive, waited until Marcus had said his piece. "Sarah, I didn't know you'd be here. I come every week, sometimes twice." She'd moved forward, kneeling to place the flowers beside Marcus's badge. Frank loved being a cop, even when he found out about Vaughn, even when he knew it might cost him everything he couldn't walk away. He said some battles you have to fight no matter the odds. He was right. He'd be glad you were here. He'd be glad Shadow helped clear your name. Sarah had reached out slowly, letting Shadow sniff her hand. The dog had accepted her touch, tail wagging slightly. Frank loved K9 units. He always said dogs were more honest than most people. They'd sat together in the shade of the oak tree, 2 people bound by loss and betrayal, and the strange redemption that had come 3 years too late for one of them. "What will you do now?" Sarah had asked. "I don't know. The department offered me my job back, but I can't go back there. Too much has changed. I've changed." "You could sue, get enough money to never work again." Marcus had shaken his head. "Money won't fix what's broken. I need to do something that matters. Something that I would make Roland proud." Sarah had smiled slightly. "He'd tell you to help people. That's what he always did. Found ways to help people the system had forgotten." They talked for another hour, sharing memories of Roland, of the man he'd been before Vaughn's corruption had taken him from them. When Sarah had finally left, she'd hugged Marcus again. "Thank you for not giving up," she'd said. "Thank you for letting Shadow tell the truth." Marcus had watched her walk away through the rows of headstones, a widow who'd helped bring down the man who'd murdered her husband. Then he'd looked at Shadow. "Come on, boy. We've got work to do." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the morning sun, outside a converted barn in the hills outside Knoxville, watching a class of young K9 handlers work with their dogs. The Brennan K9 Training Academy had opened 3 months ago, funded partly by a settlement from the state that Marcus had accepted on the condition that half would go to establishing a wrongful conviction review fund. The barn had been renovated into a proper training facility. Obstacle courses, scent training areas, obedience rings. Marcus had designed it all himself, drawing on 11 years of experience in a determination to train the next generation of K9 handlers to be better than his had been, to listen to their owners, to trust them, to understand that sometimes a dog's instincts were more reliable than human judgment. He wasn't teaching police tactics. He'd left that world behind. Instead, he focused on search and rescue therapy work, service dog training, ways dogs could help people without the complications of badges and politics and corruption. Shadow lay in the sun nearby, gray muzzle resting on his paws, watching the training with the calm satisfaction of an elder statesman. He was nearly 12 now, ancient for a German shepherd, his muzzle completely white, his movements slow and careful. But his eyes were still bright, still alert, still watching over Marcus the way he'd done for 11 years. A young handler approached a woman, maybe 25, with an eager border collie at her heel. "Mr. Brennan, questioning about scent training." Marcus had smiled. "Show me what you're working on." He'd spent the morning moving between students, correcting techniques, offering encouragement, sharing the wisdom that came from years of partnership with a dog who'd been more than just a tool, a dog who'd been family. At lunch, he'd sat on the porch of the small cabin he'd built on the property, shadow settling beside his chair, with a contented sigh. The view stretched for miles, green hills rolling toward distant mountains, no walls, no bars, no boundaries except the horizon. His phone had buzzed. A text from the Attorney General's office. Vaughn's trial had concluded. Life without parole for the murder of Roland Pierce. Additional sentences for corruption, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. The other officers in his network had been sentenced to ranging from 10 years to life depending on their involvement. Justice. Slow and imperfect, but justice nonetheless. Marcus had put the phone away and looked at Shadow. The dog had been watching him, that familiar intelligence in his eyes. "We did it, boy," Marcus had said softly. "Took us a while, but we got there." Shadow's tail had thumped once against the wooden porch. Marcus had stood walking into the cabin. On the wall above his bed hung a photograph, one of the few possessions he'd kept from before. It showed a younger Marcus and a younger Shadow 11 years ago on their first official day as partners. Both of them looking at the camera with confidence and determination and the unshakable belief that they could handle anything together. Below the photo, Marcus had written in careful script, "Where you go, I go. Promise kept." He'd meant it as closure, as a way to honor what they'd survived. But looking at it now, Marcus had realized it wasn't about the past. It was about the future. Every day with Shadow. Every sunrise they watched together, every training session with students who would carry on the work. It was all part of keeping that promise. Shadow had followed him inside, moving slowly, arthritis making his hips stiff. Marcus had helped him up onto the bed, something he had never allowed in the old days. But rules change when your partner had saved your life twice and carried the truth for 3 years. The dog had settled with a long sigh, head on Marcus's lap. Marcus had run his hand over the gray muzzle, the soft ears, the strong neck. "You're the best partner I ever had," Marcus had whispered. "The most loyal friend. You never gave up on me. Even when I'd given up on myself, you kept fighting." Shadow had looked up at him, and in those dark eyes, Marcus had seen everything. The warehouse, the trial, the 3 years of separation. The moment in the prison when Shadow had found the truth nobody else would see. The identification of Hutchins and Vaughn. All of it leading to this moment, this quiet afternoon in a cabin in the hills, free and together. "I don't know how long we've got," Marcus had continued, "because nearly 12 was ancient, and every day now was borrowed time. But however long it is, we'll spend it right here. No more danger, no more cases, just peace. You've earned that." Shadow's eyes had drifted closed, comfortable and safe, trusting Marcus to keep watch for once. Marcus had sat there as the sun moved across the sky, hand on his dog's head, thinking about justice and loyalty, and the bonds that couldn't be broken by time or distance, or the cruelty of men who'd forgotten what honor meant. Down the hill, his students worked with their dogs, learning the partnership that could save lives, or solve crimes, or simply provide comfort to people who needed it. Marcus could hear their voices, young and enthusiastic, calling commands and offering praise. A new generation, a better one, he hoped. The sun had set in shades of orange and gold, painting the hills in colors that reminded Marcus of freedom, of second chances, of promises kept and futures earned. Shadow had snored softly at peace in a way he hadn't been for 3 years. And Marcus had realized that this right here was what victory looked like. Not headlines or settlements or apologies, not the satisfaction of watching Vaughn led away in chains. Victory was a quiet cabin and a loyal dog, and the knowledge that truth, however deeply buried, would always find a way to the surface. "Thank you, boy," Marcus had whispered into the gathering dark, "for everything, for never forgetting, for never giving up, for being exactly who you always were, even when nobody else would listen." Shadow's tail had thumped once more against the blanket. Outside, the stars had begun to emerge pinpricks of light in the vast Tennessee sky. Marcus had watched them appear one by one, these same stars that had shone over the warehouse 3 years ago, over the prison, over every dark night when hope had seemed impossible. But hope hadn't died. It had waited patiently in the memory of a dog who refused to let the truth be buried. And now finally, after everything, Marcus Brennan was home. Not the house he'd lost, not the job that had been taken from him, but something better, something real. Home was wherever Shadow was, where they went together, where promises were kept and loyalty was rewarded, and the bond between a man and his dog proved stronger than lies or corruption or even death itself. The first star had brightened overhead. Marcus had made a wish, the kind you make when you've been given a second chance at life. Not for wealth or fame or revenge, just for time. Time with the partner who'd saved him. Time to train dogs who might save others. Time to live freely in the truth that had been won at such terrible cost. Shadow had stirred, lifting his head to look at Marcus one more time before settling back to sleep. And in that look, Marcus had seen everything he needed to know. They'd made it through the darkness, together, the way they'd always promised they would. That night, Shadow slept deeper than he had in years. And for the first time since the warehouse, Marcus dreamed not of darkness and betrayal, but of sunlight and open fields, of a young dog learning to trust, of a partnership forged in patience and sealed in loyalty. He woke to find Shadow watching him, head tilted, as if asking, "Good dream." Marcus smiled, running his hand over the soft ears. The best boy, the very best. Because some bonds weren't just unbreakable, they were eternal, written not in contracts or commands, but in the quiet language of trust that needed no words. Where you go, I go. Not just a promise, a truth forever.